This is a guy who's actually getting an MFA and an MBA. It's going to take him one more year, but this is the end of his MFA journey, and we're so proud of him. He's going to be a dangerous man when he graduates. Jason grew up in the Pacific Northwest and moved down here during the dot-com boom, which went bust, but he managed to stick it out. And he's worked for the past decade designing digital media of all sorts. His MFA thesis explores the act of playing video games, which should tell you something about how Jason spends his free time. Please welcome Jason Linder.
My thesis is titled Playable Character, Extending Digital Games into the Real World. And I chose this as an exploration space because digital games were a part of my life since I was very young. Video games were something I spent a lot of time with. This particular image actually has a lot of meaning for me as one of my favorite memories from childhood. And so, like a lot of people in their 30s, we've had the opportunity to watch video games develop as a medium as we've grown up. The graphics have continually gotten better. The storytelling techniques just get more deep and rich every year. The genres continue to expand into subgenres and more types of things for all sorts of people to enjoy. But I think the most interesting evolution is what's happening with the way that we play games. So traditionally, there's some sort of input device like a controller or a mouse and keyboard. But more recently, we've seen things like plastic guitars that people play, or motion control systems that can sense where you are so you can wave your arms around in front of the TV. What I think that tells us is that people are looking for more engaging ways to play these digital games. And so that got me thinking. I wonder if we can use the systems that we interact with on a day-to-day basis, or the places that we go, or even the things that we buy as inputs into digital games. These things are generating all sorts of data and track our behavior in various ways. So why can't we use that as inputs for games? There's one other thing I want to talk about in relation to video games, though, and that's the sense that I think a lot of people have that they're an escapist mechanism, that there's something that people use to check out or de-stress. And that's definitely true to a certain degree, but there's something else going on there. Games scholar Bernard Suits defines games as unnecessary obstacles that we volunteer to tackle. And he uses golf to illustrate this point. He says that if the goal of golf were really to get the little ball into the little hole, well, we just take the ball and walk it over and drop it in the hole. But it's the challenges that we put in the way of that make it a game and make it a satisfying thing to do. By overcoming those challenges, we get a little sense of accomplishment, a little shot of having bested something, and that feels good. So that's one other reason we play games. So I think we can utilize that. So my theory is that by combining real-world actions with digital games, we can create what I'm calling frameworks for accomplishment. Essentially, these would be incentive structures for our personal or community or societal goals. We'd use those little shots of accomplishment that we get along the way from playing a game as a bridge to our greater goals that we're looking for. Now, to explore this topic, I created 4 digital game prototypes. I use these as research tools to find insights and design patterns that could be used in building games of this type. And I want to go over those now, and I have a couple of the patterns I'll talk about. I don't have time to go through all of them, but I'll point out some of my favorites. The first game was a collaboration with fellow student Corey Lee. It was called The Other End. And this was a game that we made for the Grad Design Studio. And we gave all the students in there a pink card with a unique symbol on it. And they'd take this card, they'd go to one end of the studio, and they'd show it to a computer. And then they'd walk down to the other end of the design studio, show it to another computer, and they'd be rewarded with some points and be shown their best time and whatnot. So what happened here was we created a spontaneous track meet right in the middle of the studio. I mean, people People were sprinting up and down at full speed, almost to a dangerous degree. And the interesting thing that I noticed when that was happening was that all the other rule sets that we set up for the game, that there were some points that you could get on a scoreboard for having done the most trips, those were completely ignored. People just wanted to run. So that led me to my first design principle from these things, and that's this idea of progressive disclosure. I think these games would probably benefit from a staggered introduction of the rule sets for the game, so that you give something very fun to do right away that can be easily be grasped and people grab onto, and then you add things later as you go to keep the interest going. This is a good point to talk about. One thing that happens with every game is that people are going to try to get around the rules. Phil here was clever enough to take a picture of his unique code and give his card to a co-conspirator, who then stood at the other end of the hall so they could check in with like less than a second time. The interesting thing, though, is that Phil wasn't trying to do that just because he wanted to win. He was doing that because it was fun to find the ways around the rules, and that's the interesting thing there. So that when you're designing these kinds of games, it's important to not remove the fun when you remove the loopholes. Keep that in mind so that it continues to be fun. The second game that I want to talk about is Sphere Quest. This game is a more traditional style video game setup, sort of an adventure game, where you have a character that you're in control of. In this case, it's just a little sphere, but it's still a character, who you guide through the game by upgrading their abilities so that they can continue to beat the next bosses and get into the next sections of the game. For this, though, I made a twist in that I asked participants to do something in the real world in order to upgrade their characters. So, for instance, if you wanted to upgrade the character's magic, I'd ask you to acquire and eat a piece of fruit. Or if you wanted to upgrade their combat skills, I'd ask you to go holiday shopping. And I also asked that people returned some sort of proof that they had done these things, document it somehow, and it was just going to be interesting to me to see in what ways people documented this. And I got a lot of good responses. People were doing things, in the act or right after the act, or they'd provide some sort of official documentation. And that was all well and good, and I got some interesting stuff out of that. But the most important thing I found was what led me to this concept I'm calling narrative alignment. And that is, for a story-based game, something that has an arc to it and some character to it, it's rather important that the actions have some relevance to the story. In this case, the actions were a bit arbitrary. They tried to be clever and have a cutesy relationship, perhaps, with the game, but that wasn't quite enough, and people felt like they weren't sure why they were eating a piece of fruit for this game. The third game I want to talk about is Cube Lord. This was a collaboration with another student, Phil Balagtas. And in this game, we set up a sort of a property purchasing situation again in the grad design studio, where people could purchase the cubicles, the workspaces that everybody sits at. And the person who at any one time owned the most cubicles became the Cube Lord, and they got to wear this plastic crown and carry around a scepter and act all important for a little while. The thing that we did with this game, though, is that in order to get currency to buy these cubicles, you had to give up something. You had to risk something about yourself. And we asked people to give up information like social security numbers or passwords, or we had them take pictures of themselves doing odd or funny things. So we had people doing handstands. We had someone who was good enough to fill up the Britas, which nobody ever does in the studio. So that was cool. And mostly we had people just doing silly things and submitting them. This led me to the idea that I had of that these games ought to have some sort of persistent convenience to them. The thing about the way that people chose which actions to tackle was that they looked for what they could easily do right then and there, and then only secondly did they think about how embarrassing that might be. So it became really important that they just be able to do things right off the cuff. So that sort of extrapolating from that tells me that these games ought to always have something that you can do if you're standing at a bus stop or just have a couple of minutes to do something. If the only things you can do are complex and would take a while, it's more likely that that you'll lose interest in the game. And the final game prototype I created was called Simulation City. This is based on the classic video game SimCity, where you create a little virtual city on a grid and you attempt to get everything working in coordination with the various zones and types of buildings and police departments and whatnot. And I asked people to essentially play this game, but to do it with a twist, in that in order to add elements to that game grid, they needed to take a picture of a real city structure and then tell me where on that game grid it should go. What ended up happening was I got a really nice tour of San Francisco. People went out and took pictures of all sorts of interesting things that meant something to them. Maybe they were hungry. But what that told me was that people weren't looking so much for exactly how to win this game. They became distracted by the real world. There's a richness to the real world that was really interesting, and they just started taking pictures of interesting stuff. So that leads me to the design pattern I'm calling personalized collections. And this is the idea that people are looking for a way to capture in a virtual manner things in the real world that mean something to them and keep them in some form of collection. So those games gave me a lot of good info, a lot of good insights and things to build from. And I thought it was important to apply these findings in a meaningful way. So I went on to create a game that I'm calling Forest. And I'm going to spend the rest of my time here talking about this. This game was created for an actual San Francisco volunteer organization, Friends of the Urban Forest. And their goal is essentially to plant and maintain the street trees of San Francisco. So those are the trees that are available or accessible on public sidewalks and not so much in people's backyards or in the big parks. And I was fortunate enough to be able to work with them on this and learn a bit about their organization and how they structure things. And they essentially break things down into 3 categories. They have their outreach efforts, which is where they're trying to convince property owners of the benefits of having a tree planted in front of their property. There's the actual planting activities that people can go on, and there's additional volunteer activities around tree care and maintenance, and they'll send people out on teams to look for trees that might need some sort of help. At the same time, I was told about this other effort called Urban Forest Map. This is an effort that's related to Friends of the Urban Forest that's attempting to catalog and map by GPS location all of these trees in San Francisco. So these 4 things together gave me a structure with which to build a game. Particularly the Urban Forest Map was a data set that I could use as a sort of a backdrop to the technology to this game. So I'll go through how this game works. I have a couple of videos that describe it. This game is a collection game based on the personalized collections pattern. So I wanted to let people collect trees that were interesting. So they go out in the real world, and as you come upon a tree that you find interesting, you can bring up your mobile device, you can access the app, it'll search for nearby trees, and you can add that from there to your collection. And you can continue to do this throughout the day as you're moving about. You can add as many as you like. And then later, when it's time to manage your collection and take a look at it, you can access either on your phone or from a desktop computer a game board that allows you to place and collect these trees and place them however you see fit. And in this way, you create a little menagerie of trees that you've collected, and you can browse through this and fly through your map. That's just collecting trees is interesting enough, but I wanted to be able to enhance this virtual collection in some way. So I came up with a virtual currency for the game that I'm calling Leaves. You get those for doing additional things in the game. One of those would be when you collect the trees. So the game can actually tell you if there are trees nearby that can have additional things done to them for leaves. Some of these things include updating the health status of the tree, or its bloom, if it's in bloom or not. Additionally, a lot of the data is missing things like species data, so the game would have a built-in edge detection leaf system that could see what species it was and add that to the data set. And additionally, you'd be able to mark a spot where you think a tree ought to go, where there's something missing. And this could be used in outreach efforts later on. So what you use these leaves for is to purchase and add flora and landscape elements and ponds, hills, and things like that, which you can then strategically place in what I'm calling groves. And these groves, when created in such a way, will bring up wildlife and other fauna. In this way, you create a full ecosystem for your little virtual forest collection. This would have an additional hooks back into the real world in that it could hook into, say, for instance, the weather. So if there had been a storm in San Francisco recently, you'd need to go into your virtual forest and make sure everything was good and do any maintenance, because these trees, after all, are representative of real trees in the real world that could be damaged. I also wanted to point out one of the benefits of doing all this activity. So this is a picture of nearly all the trees in the data set activated at once. There's about 60,000 of them. And you can imagine by having a large set of people playing this game and constantly updating the blooming status and the health and getting all the species correct, what a valuable resource this would be not only to Friends of the Urban Forest, but to any San Francisco resident to see the health of the natural ecosystem that we exist within. Back in the game, I wanted to be able to include parts that the teamwork efforts that you can do with the volunteer organization. So the planting activities and the maintenance activities are rolled into the game. You can go and do those things, and then when it's time to claim credit for it, you can find the team leader for that day. They'll have a special code that you can access with your mobile device, and it'll check in. These are worth a lot of leaves because we want to get more people out planting trees and helping out. Additionally, at these events, you'll likely run into people who are also playing the game so that you can create friend connections within the game, and these would be worth special items within the game, unique trees or other flora or fauna that you would share between your two virtual collections, and you can start to create friend networks where you can see all the different collections. Finally, the game would have several status and reward systems built in. First and foremost, you'd be able to check into any tree that you had added and see its current real-world status. You could see how many other people had it in their collections, what its current bloom status was. People can perhaps attach photos to this, and you can see what's going on. Also, you would be able to see a real-time map of where you had added these trees and your history with the game. There are special rewards that you can get for certain achievements within the game. If you collect all of the trees, say in a certain neighborhood, you could get a badge or some sort of reward for that could be shared with your friend network. And some of those rewards would actually be worth real things, like the game would send you saplings or seed bombs, and in this way you would give back to the real urban forest, sort of creating a full circle situation. So some prototypes for this game. One of the first things I did was decide to create a physical board game version of it to explore how people played with the virtual aspect and how they would build these groves and want to see the wildlife show up and how complex the rules should be for this. I took this game to Friends of the Urban Forest and had the staff members play it. This was a fun exercise because these guys are tree nerds, and their input onto how relationships would be formed between trees was important, so I got some good scientific data. But mostly, though, they were just happy that someone was making a game about trees. Now, that same day, they had a high school group in to do some volunteer work, and it was raining, so they couldn't go out and do their thing, so they thought, oh, let's give them to the game guy. And I thought, no, this isn't ready for high school kids. They're just going to think this guy's lame. But in fact, the opposite happened. And they after getting through the rule sets, they really grabbed onto it, and they really enjoyed trying to lord it over their friends. They saw these little miniature trees and little miniature pigs and lizards that I had, and they wanted to have those for their own and not let their compatriots have them. So this kind of added on to my personalized collections idea, and that I hadn't intended that this be a competitive environment, but it was pretty obvious looking at these high school kids that it could become, or a competition could become a real motivator here. I've also created a working iPhone prototype of the game. This doesn't have a full back end, so it doesn't really save your data to the Friends network or whatnot, but you can go out into the real world, bring up a map of your location. It will show you the trees that are nearby, and you can take those then and check them into the system. And I additionally have a rudimentary game board for you to start to collect and create groves from. This one is out in the wild right now. I have several people from Friends of the Urban Forest playing it, and I'm getting a lot of good feedback on what it's like to actually be out there checking in trees and in what ways they'd want to add them to the game board. So because of that, this game is sort of unfinished, but it is something I intend to continue working on. I think the next step here will be to deploy this on a wider scale and utilize my progressive disclosure principle in that I would release a game that only had a subset of the features here, and then we'd be able to expand that over time. So people who got in on the ground floor would get the full experience, but then people could continue to come on over time. So to wrap up here, I want to look at the outlook I think there is for this kind of overlap between real-world data and digital games. The tendency of games is to follow the technology. So whether or not you think it's comfortable that technology recently has begun to invade all the nooks and crannies of our lives, I think there is a lot of opportunity with regards to games in this space. We can effectively take this data back and use it for ourselves. And there's two main sort of overarching principles why I think this works well. One, games create a lowered barrier to entry for our goals. It's much easier to start playing a game than it is to start and embark on a daunting task that we've been meaning to do. And second, these games can maintain our engagement with these goals. And like I said before, these little bits of accomplishment that we get by playing the game can help sustain us over the long haul of our general goals. And in this way, I think we can activate volunteer base or activate our own personal goals in a very positive way. Thank you.
We have time for questions, comments. Great. Are there really pigs in San Francisco? Are the wild boars here?
Not that I know of.
They move about 12 miles a year. They come to my neighborhood.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
They might make it up the peninsula then.
They are horrifying.
Have you gotten any feedback from Friends of the Urban Forest so far?
A good deal of excitement, at least. Certainly, when I first took the game idea to them, they were really excited about the opportunity to excite their user base. And then more recently, when I deployed this iPhone game, I've got about half a dozen people playing that right now. And I got one really long email response of ideas that this person had to enhance the game. A lot of good things like what bits of tree information would be useful, like whether the trees had been pruned or over pruned, things like that that I really hadn't thought of as a way a tree exists in the city.
Could this, have you thought about using this to track disease vectors like sudden oak death? Or these new beetles that are killing off the coast folks? That's kind of a bummer, but.
I think those could definitely be inputs into the game. Certainly, monitoring health is a big part of it. I'm not sure whether sudden oak death has made it into the city for us, but
I don't think it has, but one of the opportunities is to figure out what we plant instead.
mm-hmm.
You know, when you lose those trees, we don't just end up with a bare landscape. What other domains besides forest care and trees do you see this sort of strategy working in?
Well, I think any sort of distributed volunteer situation could work well. It's a little bit harder when you're trying to do something perhaps with food kitchens and things like that, because there's not as much of a data set to work with. But I believe pretty strongly that adding a game element to these things can really make engaging with those volunteer organizations a simpler process.
So what would be your next target?
My next target.
I mean, I'm pushing you on this.
Yeah.
I want to know. See it applying.
Well, one of the things I started thinking about but didn't go down the path of wasn't so much a natural thing, but it was people's relationship with the city and the infrastructures within the city, both in terms of knowing what that various things do and also in terms of safety and emergency preparedness. I think there's a lot that could be done to raise awareness around that just by exploring your city and finding out what these weird things in the sidewalk are.
Tonight, you did such a great job with the first part of your thesis with these sub-games, parts of games. And it seemed like you learned a lot from those. But since you also did a thing where you built out the whole game, can you reflect a little bit on whether you think the things that you learned from those sub-games actually bore out, like felt true, even when you built the whole game, or whether there's something you would add as a caveat to that kind of process of working out the sub-part of the problem as research?
Well, I think every situation always ends up being different, so it's hard to extrapolate from one to the other. I think that the personalized collection thing really did work well. I think people connected with that in the Simulation City game and are also doing so with the Tree game. It remains to be seen whether each one of those really plays out. Like the cheating aspect of it is something I kind of think people will always do, but if the game is about volunteering and doing something positive, maybe that's not as big of a concern, because what kind of jerk do you have to be to cheat in a game?
Okay, well, thank you so much, Jason. I want to say that this is one of the most poetic and moving thesis projects I've ever had the pleasure to encounter, and I hope you guys enjoy it as much as I do. Anne earned her MA at Syracuse University, and when she graduated, she actually worked in a number of newspapers, including the Seattle Times and the Arizona Daily Star. She moved to San Francisco to attend CCA, and her thesis work draws inspiration from her hometown of Orcas Island, Washington. And she's looking forward to graduating so she can start planning her wedding. So please welcome Anne Kennedy.
That's not all I'm going to do. There we go. So as Brenda said, today I'm going to tell you about my hometown, Orcas Island. It's my belief that a personal geography can be a great resource for any designer, and I've set about discovering as much as I can in the context of my own home. I've examined the environmental details, natural processes, and bits of pieces that make up the Orcas experience: the colors, the horizon line, the changing seasons. I use these characteristics as building blocks for my made work. Pulling from a place I know so well has helped me develop a design practice that is concept-based. My thesis seeks to create a visual language for my hometown of Orcas by using processes that are authentic to that place. In doing so, I will show that a personal experience with a place can directly influence methodologies in an art and design practice. Orcas is located northwest of Seattle, near Vancouver. It has a land area of 60 square miles and a population of 4,500 year-round, although that number probably doubles or maybe triples in the summer when the tourist season's in full swing. It's a place where geography can't be ignored, accessible only by ferry and small plane. There are no chain stores or restaurants. Instead, evergreens and madrona trees dominate the landscape, and people live down dirt roads. Growing up, we hung out in fields. We hiked trails, we explored the woods by my house countless times. In the summer, my dad took us crabbing through the San Juan Islands, and we seemed to spend as much time on the rocky beaches as we did in the water. I can still remember lying down on the dock and scooping our hands in the salty water, catching jellyfish and releasing them back. I believe there's real value in moments like these. I didn't realize how unique my upbringing was until I moved off island, but Orcas will always be a huge part of me. I have a personal connection to the outside world because of this place. My personal aesthetic is tied to Orcas. Years of watching sunsets and changing tides have developed my eye. I started my thesis process over winter break when I went home for a week and gathered as much content as I could. I explored the rainy island, taking notes, pictures, and video. I talked to locals I've known my whole life to get their stories about growing up on Orcas. Stories help us make sense of our environment, and I wanted to get as many as I could. One story was from Joe, 28, a landscaper, and it illustrates the islander relationship with the outside world. You have to make the elements beneficial for your business. I love cleaning up stuff after a windstorm because it's work. I used to go out in the wind when I was a kid and dig these extravagant ditches to release water that had built up in a place that naturally built water up. But I wasn't satisfied with that, so I'd spend hours rerouting this water to the point where it was just a trickle or entirely dissipated. And now I do that as an adult on a little bit bigger scale. Bigger hand tools, I suppose. And I enjoy it, you know. This kind of interaction with the natural world is part of the everyday on Orcas, from childhood to adulthood. Islanders take pride in this. Orcas is part of who they are. Topophilia describes people's love for a place, an identity tied to place. As someone who has topophilia, I feel an obligation to tell the Orcas story. And you don't know Joe because you're not from Orcas, but it's the kind of place where everybody knows everybody. And when I say Joe as one name, people know who I'm talking about. I had another longtime local, Allison, send me a collection of things that represent the island to her. Her accompanying letter is revealing. It was in these bits and pieces, these fragments that Allison found, that I hoped to find the beginnings of visual language for a place. Because I've been trying to get at what the idea of place means as a designer, I knew I needed actual artifacts from Orcas to help me find my way. She lists specific people: Carol Anderson's earrings, Ben Kirby's coffee. She includes 2 ferry schedules, one for the house and one for the car, and adds a disclaimer: you'll want to take the rocks out of the bag because they're still wet. Through Allison's artifact collection, we learned so much about local commerce, community, and environment. Here are some ephemera from local businesses, and some pieces taken from the natural landscape: madrona tree bark, rocks, beach glass, driftwood, and clamshells. I also brought some human artifacts with me today. They're my family, and they're sitting right over there. I'd be interested to push this method further and see more collections from other locals to see what gets repeated and what changes. What would a collection look like from someone who spent 20 plus years in San Francisco, a city whose land area is nearly equal to Orcas, or a Phoenix suburb? In Al's collection alone, the artifacts act like icons that can be rearranged and edited to tell stories about place, like the beach or the landscape or the vernacular. Stir-crazy locals jokingly call Orcas the Rock. And since I too know Orcas so well, I tried to draw on my own memory and my own stories about the place as a method for generating more content. Could I remember the locations of different landmarks? Or where I'd spent the most time? Quick sketches help me get ideas out quickly, like free writing, and get unstuck. But I found my illustrations, meant to reflect patterns in nature on the island, too arbitrary. Since one of my goals in this project is to create generative methodologies that make stuff based on the place, I thought about more ways to use specific island properties to generate form. The Orcas landscape is made up of many moments and changing characteristics that build on each other. With this in mind, I began mapping colors and textures on Orcas and examining their relationships. The moments can be used to build vignettes about place. Reimagine landscapes. Feelings like loneliness. A perfect July day. Or a West Beach sunset in August. Or they can be used to tell bigger narratives about longer periods of time or changing seasons. Orcas is primarily made up of blues and greens, and as you can see in this calendar, while I usually say the best time to visit is in the summer, here you can see the subtle changes, beautiful really throughout the whole year. As I got deeper into my process, I became increasingly preoccupied with the notion that time and place are tied together. Places change and shape over time. I like the way Gretel Elrich describes this relationship. She says, "I like to think of landscape not as a fixed place, but a path that is unwinding before my eyes and under my feet." These are layered images of the same place at different times. The reason I can even make these picture collages of Orcas beaches over the course of many years is because that's where I spend a lot of my time when I'm home. The photos themselves are simple, just another sunset photo. But together, they emphasize the nuance in place. The reason I have these photos is because I've been struck many times by the beauty of the sun setting, even on an ordinary Orcas day, over a horizon line that I've seen my whole life. This is Mount Constitution, the highest point in the San Juans. And Crescent Beach. It's one of the few places with good cell phone service, so that's my boyfriend on the right making a call. And a few years earlier, I took some friends kayaking, and that's where we launched from. The horizon line, though unwavering, is a constant reminder of time as the sun sets and rises over it. David Abrams says, "The visible horizon is a kind of gateway or threshold, joining the presence of the surrounding terrain to that which exceeds this open presence, to that which is hidden beyond the horizon. The horizon carries the promise of something more, something other." Here we have made our first discovery. The way that other places not explicitly present within the perceivable landscape, are nevertheless joined to the present landscape by the visible horizon. And so let us ask, is it possible that the realms that we are looking for, the place of the past and that of the present, of the future, are precisely beyond the horizon? The Orcas geography is ever present. The ocean, green forests, and hills that dip and flow, the Cascade Mountains in one direction, Mount Baker in another. The San Juan Archipelago is certainly worth looking at. But the islands, constant, are the biggest part of the island geography. They remind you that you are quite literally stuck on an island, isolated. I decided to use this feeling of isolation as a way of generating form. This was a breakthrough for me in my work because it showed me how using a simple concept that relates to a place can help establish a generative methodology. The combinations I could make felt seemingly endless. First, I isolated the island shapes and collaged them together. Then I looked at what was left without the islands on the horizon, without their silhouettes, and isolated everything else. And then I remixed them as new landscapes. Or groupings like ocean. And sky. And that's something we all do, right? Our memories of place are not perfectly linear. We tend to mix it up. Often we remember a feeling. When we think of places we've been or places we know well, the picture in our mind is a mashup of many memories. Isolated moments collapse together. For these images, I isolated different moments in time and place. A wave breaking, the shapes in the sky, island silhouettes, and collaged them together. Barry Lopez says, I think of two landscapes, one outside the self, the other within. The external landscape is the one we see. The interior landscape responds to the character and subtlety of an exterior landscape. The shape of the individual mind is as affected by land as it is by genes. I'd like to think of these images, collapsed moments in time, as projections of my interior landscape. Lopez goes on to say that the way we achieve harmony between the two landscapes is through storytelling. And for me, my thesis has done that. This is a spread from my thesis book in which I use the visual language that I've created to illustrate my Orcas story. Most importantly, I've developed a way of working that is concept-based. Like an architect approaching a new building project, my work is site-specific. And I look forward to finding new places that demand new possibilities. Site-specific design should be imbued with the feeling of the place that has inspired it. Defining this visual language for Orcas only excites me about the possibilities for my new home, San Francisco. These steps that have built on each other took me to unexpected places. And maybe that's the real lesson for me, that inspiration is all around us in the real world. And I like that metaphor that a canvas or my made work is its own landscape. As I let my past influence my way of working and my way of making, the work itself is influenced by its past, waiting to reveal new places I could go just beyond its horizon. Thanks for letting me tell my story.
What do you do for a horizon in a city that's usually foggy?
I think I would maybe not focus on a horizon in a city that's usually foggy. And that's why I showed that specific photo with the fog covering the Golden Gate Bridge, because for each place there are different characteristics to focus on. So, I don't know.
There's such a sense of quietness in these images. Do you think that you're on a sort of interior balance and harmony
like to hope so. I don't know if I can always find my own interior quietness and harmony, but
You just go back and look at these pictures.
yeah, I can use them to get in the zone maybe, or do a little yoga or something.
There's such a strong component of the natural environment in the aesthetic that's evolved here. And it's, pretty obviously understandable in the Orcas context. And you imported it to some extent into your treatment of San Francisco. It was a very ethereal, fog, soft landscape. And I'm just wondering whether, even though you say that it is about an exploration of the aesthetic that emerges out of a place and how that informs the process, whether there is something about the grit and the grime and the pace and the noise of an intense urban environment that would not work so well in establishing this, what you have tried to establish.
Well, I don't think I would be able, again, I wouldn't be able to approach San Francisco in the same way as Orcas. I think it would probably, I think particularly for that photo, because I have such a strong connection to the outside world, in San Francisco I've kind of found those places. So I live near the Presidio and Baker Beach and went there a lot, and Golden Gate Park and things like that. But I think if I were to actually delve deeper into it, that yes, it wouldn't look anything. It would look completely different and be a completely different project.
A syringe, some broken glass. No, I'm serious.
Yeah.
Coupled up Coke can.
I mean, I think that would have to be a part that comes into it. I don't know. I'd have to explore it further.
Barry, designers can aesthetize
Share with the class lesson.
What?
You didn't all hear that.
But I said designers can aestheticize anything, even syringes. Yeah. I mean, I see this, I saw your presentation, was it 3-4 weeks ago? 3 weeks ago? And I think it's tighter now. And I really like the fact that you situate yourself with respect to the work. But I still believe that you could extend this. This could be an entire series. You could say, I'm just going to look at island locations. And you could take Manhattan. And it could be exquisitely beautiful and look very different.
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, you lucked out because this is such a naturally beautiful place.
Yeah.
But I think that the way you handled it, you could proceed and take on, you could do a whole series just on islands.
I would love to.
What I see now with the San Francisco is sort of making San Francisco, I see that she's making San Francisco into, her home. I mean, it's
Yeah.
through the lens of your island home.
But isn't that a way to test your methodology too? Does it work on San Francisco? Does it work on these other
Yeah,
islands?
no, I actually, I think it would actually.
Oh, yeah. I agree. I want to see it though. I want to see it, yeah.
I have one other question that I've been dying to ask. It seems that in the collections that you showed at the beginning, we got the sort of micro, but the work really spreads out into these long views. One of my favorite parts is where the water is coming over the shingle and it's matched up in the one where your boyfriend is making a phone call. That's about as close as we get. There's always the long view. And I'm wondering, is that just a tendency that you have? Was it a conscious choice to look at the long view as opposed to the micro?
Well, I think that's part of why I tried to get that collection and also I think it came out of, I don't know if it's a tendency, but I think that maybe with photography that's in some ways a tendency, just sort of click and shoot, snapshot, which is kind of what I was doing. So I have some details, but I didn't take that many of them when I was home. So I think that part of that was just being here in San Francisco and not having access to the island directly. But it wasn't like a conscious choice, I guess.
Well, I think it's It's definitely part of the aesthetic. So one of the things that fascinates me, this sounds irrelevant, but I think it's not, about the construction of Greek theaters was that the situation of a Greek theater needed to have a long view. There was this necessity for the long view, and the way that idea was constructed. And when the Romans built theaters and they closed off that long view, some interestingly bad things happened to drama. You know, it may not be causality, but certainly correspondence. So there's a way in which I think the long view does something to us spiritually that has captivated you.
I don't know, it might just be a lot of sitting on the ferry with long view and just watching the, I have had a lot of downtime to do that, so maybe I am captivated.
One more?
Yeah, I thought it was a beautiful work and a really great presentation. One of the things I find really interesting in this work is that although we're looking at it in a design context, I think it really transcends design and moves far into a photography sensibility. And I would encourage you, if you haven't yet, to really show this to people within photography departments and get a really different perspective and discussion about this. Definitely.
Yeah, I haven't done it yet, but I am planning on doing that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Paul Wood grew up in Pasadena, California, one of my favorite places, in a family and an environment that was full of art and design. His thesis work in our MFA program is based on his work in Eastern Kenya, where he practiced design research methodologies to identify opportunities for intercultural collaboration and social business. So Paul is a member of one of the winning teams of the CCA Impact Award for Social Entrepreneurship, and the cash award will help fund the establishment of the Wazo Design Institute that he will begin building in Kenya this summer. His training in design research and product development, as well as his international experience in Kenya, continue to drive his work in multi-directional application and cross-pollination of ideas between more and less industrialized economies. Please welcome Paul Wood.
Thank you, Brenda. Thank you, everyone else, for coming today. The title of my thesis is Lessons from Development, the Value of Emerging Economies on Industrialization. I can't see anybody here. And the mission of my thesis is to engage these emerging economies as stakeholders in the design process so that we might find more creative, diverse, and sustainable material culture as a result. I'm really interested in the value of the local and the individual and the bespoke as ways to influence product development. And I know that designers now looking for innovative ways to reintroduce craft to mechanized production and design no longer have to be associated with what William Morris was associated with, which is this regression and nostalgia. William is sort of the iconic person of the arts and crafts movement at the end of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and he was just sort of at the wrong place at the wrong time. But today we can sort of use emerging economies as absolutely up-to-date social and cultural resource similar to pre-industrial America. And as Brenda was saying, I think there's an immense value in the cross-pollination of ideas between these two types of economies. I'd like to start by just kind of explaining what the difference is here between these two places. And thinking about an emerging economy like Kenya, we're looking at low-tech solutions to product development, craft-based production, inexpensive labor cost, a unique set of available materials, and a sort of lack of representation of product development on a global market. In comparison, I have this picture of these kind of corny-looking German guys who have a industrial manufacturing place in Germany. And the difference here, you're kind of looking at the opposite. High-tech solutions, industrial manufacturing, high labor costs, materials that are mainly appropriate to the industrial technology and therefore kind of standardized, especially when you're looking at something like shoes, and are often so well represented on a global market that they become intrusive and culturally inappropriate product marketing. So I don't necessarily think that this one is any better than that one or the other way around. I think really that together what we can do is start to pull the best traits from both and be able to come up with solutions in product development that way. So one example I think is really great about what is sustainability. I mean, all this is kind of aimed towards creating more sustainable products, but what I'm looking at is sustainability through enduring meaning. So if you look at a rosary, this is an object that's typically made from real cheap, easy materials like plastic, thread, chain, beads. But the value of this object is not its materiality or its means of production, but its kind of spiritual, enduring meaning to the person that owns it. So, it's because you love an object that you might be willing to keep it for longer, and this is actually sustainable behavior. Another quick example here of something that I found in Kenya was this two types of maracas. So if you can see here, like the one, the kind of value that you see in the one on the left there is that of kind of a finely finished industrial product. But the other one is completely different type of value. It's that of a narrative. The fact that you can see that this was made from an old spray can, whittled from a little piece of wood and put together. There's a story-based value there. It doesn't have to be spirituality. It could be story, memory, or personalization that adds this type of value to an object. So if we look at this thing in particular, we can see this as an example of what John Thacker explains as a tool or a platform that exists in emerging economies as this kind of thing that's maybe ugly to our own sensibilities, but gives designers an opportunity to go in, take a look at these innovative solutions in product development and add beauty to them or add scale. So my goals for my thesis were to establish a platform and a tool focusing on local and international markets to develop a variety of portable solutions that might augment Kenyan craft there in Kenya and to showcase the local trends and styles of Kenya in more of a global marketplace. So as Brenda was saying, the Wazo Design Institute, I'm not going to go into much today, but is the platform that we developed to start to make these types of products. This is a business plan that we developed that's based off of social business. It's a non-loss, non-dividend company where all the profits above and beyond the operational costs of the business will go back into the business. And it's based off of a meritocratic system that anyone who's willing to contribute and based off their merit can enter the company at any level. And the tool that I was looking at was shoes. And I'd like to explain quickly why I picked shoes, because I think they're a really great case study for this. One, shoes aren't an incredibly complex object. They're typically made of only 4 parts: an upper part that has kind of the fabric of your shoe, the inner sole, the midsole, and the outer sole that hits the ground. They prevent us from injury and disease, of course, but they also provide a sort of crucial first rung of the ladder for this for emerging economies. The needle industry, as they say, can operate with very little energy and very little experience, actually. It's still a very labor-intensive object. As much as you think shoes are completely an automated thing, as pervasive as they are, they're still actually quite labor-intensive. And they're in the fashion realm, which is this story-based medium that I'm talking about, that although we might see this type of thing like an UGG, there's actually quite a bit of story behind that that goes on for 200 years, where sheepskin was this kind of material that supposedly kind of kept you warm in the winter and cool in the summer. and was used, and it's actually, called Uggs because they were supposedly ugly shoes at the time. And so I'd like to go through the ecology of the shoe market, starting with something like a really advanced modern Nike trainer. This is a shoe that can be kind of made of several hundred parts, 60 people on a line, 4 lines in a place in China or something, with very complicated machinery that puts them together, liquid injected synthetic soling materials that go on the bottom. And if we look at something kind of right next to that, we're looking at something like a clog, which is actually quite a simple shoe made from less than 5 parts, but still has this kind of liquid injected soling material process that's not only irreparable by someone that might want to fix it, it's kind of incomprehensible by someone who might want to go about creating another one. Looking at the other side of the shoe realm, we look at something like a tire shoe. Very simple object that I found in Kenya. 2 materials, tires and nails, and only 5 operations to put it together. One step above that, you might see something like a moccasin. One of the oldest shoe constructions in the world. A single layer section with only 1 material and can be put together in less than 10 operations. And so what I'm trying to do is kind of position myself in the middle of these 2 things. How can we pull from some of the best material and production traits of both sides of the ecology of the shoe market? So first I started looking at the production and material insights from Kenya, starting with goat skins, which were a interesting product in Kenya, where if you buy a goat from a vendor, you can use it for several years for grazing and whatever else, and once it's kind of put down for slaughter, you can return that skin as you might with a Coke bottle and get a small refund on your money. And as a result, you can buy these goat skins for a couple dollars for a kilo of them, a big stack. This tire material, again, they make these tire sandals just by stripping the outer edge of a tire and cutting them down to the shape that they want, using them for sandals. These conga materials, which are worn all over Kenya, super bright colors and really intricate patterning that are really worn with pride by the Kenyan women and selected carefully. And I thought it was a great thing to represent in the product. Also, some of the biggest agricultural exports in Kenya, corn, coconut fibers and coconuts, and raffia palm, which is a material that was introduced by Spanish colonialists and is used in crafts such as the bed that you see here. It's made in hats and put in shoes and all kinds of stuff. And look at some of these low-tech solutions for production, like foot-pedaled sewing machines, these hand-drawn templates, and some of these traditional stitching patterns, like this cross stitch that you can see in Kenyan cultures and also in moccasin construction. So then pairing that with some of the production and material insights from the United States really kind of brought me to the point where I needed to learn how to sew and just find out what are the pain points of the production process here that I might go through as someone who's trying to put together a shoe for the first time. And really looking at things like just the order of operations of how you put a shoe together, and some of the connection points between the upper part of the shoe and the outer sole. So this was me just ripping apart a Tom shoe, coming out of my closet and trying to put it back together. And again, some of the biggest pain points there were how do I get these order of operations correct so the stitching doesn't have like 5 lines of stitching. And one of the other biggest ones was how do I connect this to this liquid injected soling material that they have? Well, I can't. So this was a big pain point for me of how do I accomplish putting a shoe onto an outer sole in a more seamless fashion, more easy fashion. So I was looking at several different methods of how this is accomplished, and one of the easiest one is this Weltschoen or stitch down method, where you basically just have an outer sole that has a flange on the side, and you can stitch around the edge of the shoe, and it's used for affordable, lightweight, flexible, casual footwear all the time. This was one of the first prototypes that I did that I tried to use that stitch down method along the edge there with a little flange. And I was trying to use a little whip stitch around the front toe box there, as I saw in some of the moccasin constructions. One of the other things I was interested in doing was taking some of this really, the mechanized procedures for molding outer soles of shoes and try and, break that down to its bare bones and use these very cheap, kind of messy, dirty plaster molds. This was some of my first experiments with mixing some of those local materials and fibers that I found in Kenya, like coconut, with some of these rubber compounds, and try and see how I could use the least amount of local, just natural fibers with the most amount of that and the least amount of rubber. And so these were some of my first experiments using the corn husks on the far left, the coconut, and kind of pressing it down with a little leather rim to give it a better structural integrity, some burlap and corn husk, and actually on the far right there you can see an outer sole that has ground up tire dust, which you can buy in huge bulk in Kenya, mixed in with the rubber on the bottom layer. So again, now this was my first prototype, and what I tried to do is use as many of these components as I can. This time I was using tire on the bottom, just a straight cut piece of tire, and using the Veldschoen stitch method on the bottom, on the flange. I was using this goat skin and some of the moccasin stitching patterns around the toe box, and trying to incorporate those really fun, beautiful African fabrics to try and represent the eccentricity found in Kenya, but use this kind of clean black finish to the goat skin to see if this would be more of a shoe that attracts to more global sensibilities. The second one that I put together is quite similar, but this time I used some of the molded corn husk rubber for the outer sole and introduced this outer flange again so that I could do the stitch down method and put little rivets that you can use this little hand mechanized system to put in for the lacing. So at that point, these, I'll go back, these rubber outer soles were really awesome, and I was really interested in going forward with the corn rubber because some of these long fibers helped with the structural integrity, but it also kind of hides a little bit of the defects that you might find with some of these low-tech plaster molds. One of the problems with the first prototype is that the bottom was super slick. And so I was looking at some of these conga patterns and see how I might be able to pull some of these patterns and introduce them into the shoe. So I did a lot of ideation about how, what types of patterns might be good for the tread of the bottom of the shoe. And I used the CNC milling machine, which is this computer numerically controlled machine we have upstairs, to make a kind of masterpiece reference for myself of how this would work. So I used this floral pattern, but made them quite large and tapered on the edge so that they would be able to pop out of this mold. And on the other side, which isn't shown, I created a little groove inside of that flange so you could hide the edge of the fabric as it comes out to the edge of the shoe. So this is a result of some of the floral patterns that are molded into the rubber. This is the last prototype that is quite similar, except the rivets I used really colorful blue rivets, and I used this Algonquin Indian stitch up the middle of the shoe. Algonquin stitch is just a shoe that has the front part of the toe cap just connected in the middle. And you can see that the edge is much cleaner because, see, I have there's the Algonquin. Here's the difference between the outer flange. So when I created that first prototype there, there's a little, I was a little discouraged by the sort of ugliness of that because we're just doing a stitch there. We're doing it very simple. It can tend to peel up and become a little ugly. So I did a little groove inside of that outer flange so it can embed itself in there and have a nice clean edge. So these are some of my last prototypes. And I think, these are one step and one solution that I want to bring to something like the Wazo Design Institute as examples for a more sustainable product development. So this is something that I think can start to provide the owner of the shoe a slightly better entry point into the construction of it and the meaning of it, and where these materials came from and why, and how it was maybe put together. And so I don't think this is the solution, but I think things like these are great to bring to an area like that, where we're going to start very simply creating a simple shoe out of tires. But as it progresses, we'll be able to brainstorm together on how the sensibilities of my culture might pair up with some of the production methods and materials of their culture, and how we might be able to come up with a more sustainable material culture globally. I'd just like to end by saying that I think, again, there's a really great sort of circular cycle here. Designers, in the U.S. are always looking for work. Will be soon, and people over there in Kenya are always looking for opportunities for work. And I don't think anyone's going to cut anyone out here. I think there's a lot of opportunities for designers to work with communities in places like Kenya, and there's opportunity for these places that are typically hidden on the global market to start to come out. And I think the cross-pollination of ideas there is going to help everyone. So thank you very much.
We have time for a few questions or a conversation.
Yes. Where can I buy a pair?
They're not for sale yet.
Okay. I was really wondering about the rivets. Are those difficult for Africans to be able to come by?
Yeah, so that's one of the tools I didn't actually show as something that we could port over to Kenya, but there's some hand mechanized tools that you can use to just crimp those down. So those are the kinds of things that I was looking for to just offer those small little improvements. How can we take like one tool and be able to take it over there, and they would be able to use it just as well as I am in the studio. So part of the reason like my difficulties with making shoes for the first time was a benefit, because everyone that I would be experimenting with in Kenya would be doing it for the first time too. So all those trials and tribulations were actually benefits for creating the shoe.
Are they comfortable?
Yes, they're very Yeah, I made it to my size, so I was wearing them around a little bit. One of the cool things I thought was that once you start to walk on those corn husk fibers, they start to come out of the shoe a little bit and give a little more, visual narrative to it, and a little more traction to the bottom of the shoe.
So they're kind of corny shoes.
They're corny in the material sense. Barry?
Yeah, well, it's just wonderful. I mean, it's so inspiring to see this kind of work. One of the things that we're seeing in lots of places is that design initiatives in countries that have completely different constraints than we have here, or to put it simply, much poorer countries, are starting to generate truly profound insights about design here.
Right.
Under our constraints. The R&I clinic is telling us things about what ophthalmic treatments could be here, universal design principles that make it easier for the blind or the wheelchair-bound people to get into buildings are telling us things about how to design buildings better, not just for people in those situations. So I guess my question is, what's bounced back to you in terms of giving you insights about design in our culture, the work that you have done in Kenya?
Yeah, I mean, one of the conversations I had with you was really great about the idea of this leapfrog development that you were talking about, where, you gave the example of these wireless communication networks, all these satellites that we've set up for wireless communication and cell phones in in the United States and other industrialized countries have now been taken over or used by emerging economies, and so cell phone development in emerging economies is bigger than anywhere else because they're able to just piggyback on things like the satellites that we've already put up in the sky. So that's a great example, and there's a lot of other examples. When you go over there, people are very, the way that they look on something is very tried and true. They're like, no, you can't do it that way. You have to do it this way. There's a lot of little things. It's very slow. When you go over there, it's really hard to move forward, but it's because you have to just totally rid yourself of like, no, I want to do it this way, because everyone's kind of has these really outlandish ideas about how to put together a shoe. When I first did a workshop in Kenya, I don't know if you remember that shoe that was shown there with the cross stitching on it. That was a little boy who I brought a bunch of materials to this rural village, and he just started making a shoe right away. And he just had this goat skin that still had fur on it, and he just wrapped it around, and it was basically like a square. And at first when we were putting that together, I'm like, no, like, you don't understand. That's not what we're trying to do. And then by the end, it was like, I'm so glad that he did that, because it really gave me some reference as to how they might just think a little bit differently about something and how I could utilize that stitching pad. At the time, I didn't think it was I thought it was a waste of time, but now when I brought it back, it's great. So, yeah.
I have a directional question about, is this a one-way valve? Is it a univalve? In the sense that we are, we have to be careful when we do these kinds of projects that we don't smack of non-third world arrogance. I mean, even the term, I have a friend who's from a supposed third world country. She bristles at being called third world.
Yeah.
Where are the Kenyans represented in the presentation, aside from your being in the position of having the equipment to photograph them and tell their story? How does their story come through in as unfiltered or as acknowledged a way as possible? It's a representation question.
Right. I think one thing is that we tried to set up this design institute where we're going to go over there and try and set it up in a way that's based off of social business and this meritocratic system where, we're handing that over to them. So that's the collaboration of designers that might have inspiration as to how to represent Kenyan trends and Kenyan styles and Kenyan materials on a larger scale. So that's important to them. When you first go over there, one of their first questions is, how can you sell my little hat that I made in America? And that's a very tough question, because there's a lot that goes into something like that. But they are looking to, just like we are, to expand product development to the furthest reaches of the world. They're looking for setting up a business like anyone else. So what we're trying to do is basically set up a system that we can put in place, give them a brand, give them something to rally on.
Who is we?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Who is we in your
I have put together the Wazo Design Institute with a group of 3 other people at this
here?
school. Yes. So
Yeah.
one is
I think that's part of my question.
Yeah. One of them is a design business major who's helped us out with some of the distribution and finance stuff. Konina Biswas is in our program, and she's helped with some of the graphic development on how to brand this correctly so that we can go, when we take it to Kenya, we'll have something to say, this is yours and this is, a face to it, give it a face and give it a place. And Ben Ilka is our last person who's worked in the Peace Corps in Ethiopia for a long time, and he's helping us write some of the training manuals. So what we're going to do is host a couple workshops in Kenya where we can take students out for a day or so and bring them to a row of kiosks and say which one stood out to you and why, like what were the colors that work there. Do some design blitzes on creating a product, and lots of different exercises there. And then after we leave, we can feel good about being the inspiration as designers from the United States. But we're working with a nonprofit there in Kenya who tries to do socially driven projects in the community, and we're going to hand that over to them so that they can continue with the project. and not just create shoes, but use the type of design thinking methodologies that we bring and some of the insights as to how this might be better represented on a global market, and leave them there as a training tool in case they want to create a product other than a shoe.
Paul,
Yeah.
can you tell us a little bit about your connection to Kenya, how you selected Kenya as the first country to work in, and also where might you see yourselves going next?
Yeah, Kenya sort of selected me. I got an internship last summer through a nonprofit, now has turned for-profit, in Washington, D.C. called Think Impact. And they bring professional and young adults to emerging economies, I think currently right now just in South Africa and Kenya. And they accepted me on an internship to go there last summer. At the time, that whole program was set up so that an internship, you'd identify a project like I did with the shoes, and it would turn into a fellowship, which is a year-long, sustained, presence in Kenya. But they had financial trouble and they had to cancel the fellowships. But I was able to use that projects that I developed for the fellowship for the Impact Award at CCA, which just worked out really well. And I think this type of model can work anywhere, really. And I would love for it to expand. I don't know exactly where it'll take me next necessarily, but I hope it will take me other places.
When Paul got this initial internship, my first thought was, do they make 1 million SPFs?
Yeah. I had to use a lot of sunscreen. When we got out there, there's unfortunately albino Kenyans that are out there, and when you get out to the places that we were at, there's no such thing as sunscreen, and so miserable kids that are constantly sunburned. So we left all of our sunscreen with those guys. Yeah.
Well, we're very proud of you.